They'll be speaking from Genesis chapter 32 today. And you can turn to the screen as I read that for us. Verse 22. That night, Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 sons and crossed the ford of Jabbok. After he had sent them across the stream, he sent over all his possessions. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Then the man said, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." Verse 27, the man asked him, "What is your name?" He answered. Then the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome." Jacob said, "Please tell me your name." But he replied, "Why do you ask my name?" Then he blessed him there. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "It is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared." The sun rose above him as he passed Peniel, and he was limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the Israelites do not eat the tendon attached to the socket of the hip, because the socket of Jacob's hip was touched near the tendon. With that, let me introduce our very first speaker. Can we all cheer for Kenneth Tang?
Thank you so much, Chris and thank you so much, Chris and Dan. Hi, good morning. My name is Kenneth. About 6 years ago, I came to faith through Alpha. But before that, my life was definitely a roller coaster. But having Jesus into my life didn't mean that everything was smooth sailing either. I would come to church on Sundays, but at the same time doubt if God even exists. During worship service, I'll be singing, but at the same time finding myself staring at the ceiling, staring at those circular air vents, and asking, "God, where are you?" I was wrestling with my doubts. I was wrestling with my identity. And to be honest, I felt like a fake. I felt like an imposter in this community because God seemed to be hidden from me. And I wonder if you today also feel like God is hidden in your wrestling. And what are you wrestling with today? Are you wrestling about God? Or maybe with God? Or perhaps you're wrestling with other people. Maybe it's a conflict in a relationship you once treasured. I want to encourage you that the God who seems hidden is not the same as the God who is absent. As we will see in today's passage, the God who feels hidden is actually closer than we think, close enough to wrestle with us. But before we dive into today's passage of Jacob's wrestling, I want to give you Jacob's origin story through 3 key moments in his life. Because this is important, because it will really add weight to the wrestling match. And his story is really interesting. I think if Christopher Nolan were to make a movie out of his story, it would be titled, Deception. In this story, the first key moment happens in chapter 25, his birth story. We read in verse 24 to 26. When the time came for her to give birth, there were twin boys in her womb. The first to come out was red, and his whole body was like a hairy garment. So they named him Esau. After this, his brother came out, with his hand grasping Esau's heel. So he was named Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when Rebekah gave birth to them. Jacob comes out of the womb, grasping onto Esau's heel. Jacob's name literally means heel grabber. And he was grasping onto Esau, the firstborn. Because back then, being the firstborn was extremely important. It would give you a big advantage in life. It would have determined your inheritance. It would have determined your social standing and also the type of blessing that you will get. So in this birth story, we see that Jacob grasping onto Esau's heel shows us that Jacob was someone who reaches for something that doesn't belong to him. Now, Esau being the firstborn also meant that he was supposed to get this special firstborn blessing. This blessing is special because once it's given out, it cannot be repeated again. It cannot be done again. And here's the plot twist. Before the twins were born, God actually told their mother, Rebecca, that the older will serve the younger. And this back then, in their culture back then, this did not make sense, having an older serving the younger. So what does Rebecca do? She did not trust God with this promise. So she took matters into her own hands and taught Jacob to steal the firstborn blessing from Esau. And we read, and this brings us to a second key moment. We read this in Genesis chapter 27, verse 24. This is his father Isaac asking, "Are you really my son Esau?" he asked. "I am," he replied. Jacob lied directly to his father, and it worked. He got his firstborn blessing. And in this key moment, Rebecca and Jacob show us a truth about ourselves, that sometimes when it's hard to trust God, we take matters into our own hands. And even though we know we may do things that may be wrong, we do it anyway. And back to the story. Now, because Esau's firstborn blessing had been stolen, Esau is mad. He wanted to kill Jacob. And this forced Jacob to flee to a faraway land up north called Padan Aram. This brings us to our third key moment. At Padan Aram, Jacob finally meets his contender in this game of deception. First, he meets this beautiful girl named Rachel, whom he wanted to marry. But her father, named Laban, deceived him by tricking Jacob into marrying his elder daughter first, before he gets to marry the younger daughter, Rachel. And then, when Jacob was working for him, Laban tricks him again by changing his salary, changing his wages. You know, in local Malaysian context, we call this kena con. And Jacob kena con twice. So what does Jacob do? Jacob cons him back by doing something with the animals so that he keeps all the stronger animals, and cons him again by leaving without telling him. Jacob, the deceiver himself, was trapped in a cycle of deception. And this third key moment tells us that sometimes it's very difficult to break this cycle of deception and hurt. And sometimes that could be us. Those who deceive us, we deceive back. Those who have hurt us, we hurt back. Instead of breaking this cycle, we return the favor. And all this leads to our story today. As God told Jacob to return home to Canaan, Esau was now coming toward him with 400 men. Jacob was sure he was about to be attacked. At this point, Jacob was desperate. And he makes this prayer to God in Genesis chapter 32, verse 10 to 11. "I am unworthy of all the kindness and faithfulness you have shown your servant. Save me, I pray, from the hand of my brother Esau, for I am afraid that he will come and attack me." In his prayer, we not only see desperation, but we also see complete honesty with God. He was honest that he felt unworthy. Because in the three key moments, we see that Jacob was a person that goes after things that doesn't belong to him, and Jacob is willing to deceive others just to get his way, and Jacob returns hurt for hurt. And I wonder if we see ourselves in any parts of Jacob's imperfect character. Maybe we too have deceived others or manipulated others to a point where we feel like we don't deserve God anymore. Jacob was imperfect, therefore felt unworthy. But there is good news here. There is good news for imperfect, flawed people like you and I. And it's that imperfection is never an obstacle to God, but it's an invitation to God. The Bible never tells us that we have to earn our way to God. But the Bible promises that even though we are undeserving, and in all our sin and struggles, God comes to us. The first chapter of John's Gospel tells us this, John chapter 1 verse 1. "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." Then in verse 14, "The Word became flesh and made His dwelling among us." God became flesh through Jesus and made His dwelling among us. The Creator enters creation. This means the God of the universe is not a distant God. He is not absent from your daily struggles. He's not just watching your mess from afar. He's in the mess with you, wrestling right alongside you. So today, if you feel like God is hidden from you in your wrestling, you can truly know that He is not absent. He is present. And it's this loving presence of God that will transform us from the inside out, that will transform our deceptive hearts to truthful hearts, that will transform our hurt hearts to healed hearts. But what does this actually look like in our lives? How does God actually show up and wrestle with people like Jacob, with people like you and me? To show us what this divine wrestling match looks like, let's give it up for YuShen.
Thank you, Kenneth, for kickstarting Preachmania with that insightful origin story of Jacob. Thank you also for bravely going first. Hello, everyone. My name is YuShen, and it is a privilege to continue sharing God's word with you today. I wonder what comes to your mind when someone says wrestling. For me, I think of two sumo wrestlers having a go. I think of Hulk Hogan versus Andre the Giant. Some of you in this crowd may be old enough to remember that. They're from the WWF, and the WWF then stood for the Worldwide Wrestling Federation and not the World Wildlife Fund, although I do believe that some animals actually wrestle. On a more personal note, I remember play wrestling with my father as a young child. Now, whatever impression of wrestling comes to your mind, wrestling always involves proximity and close contact. And now this brings us back to the ongoing story, the unfolding story of Jacob in Genesis chapter 32, verses 24 to 26. Allow me to read the verse for you, and the words will also appear on the screen behind me. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Then the man said, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." Amen. Now, imagine being all alone in the dark wilderness at night when you suddenly encounter an unexpected man. I don't know about you, but I would have run as fast as I could in the opposite direction. But surprisingly, Jacob didn't. He stayed and he wrestled with the man. Now, no one knows exactly why he did it, but perhaps he thought he had nothing else to lose given his dire circumstances. The Hebrew word for wrestle in this verse is abak, and it literally means to grapple or to get dusty. In the desert wilderness near the Jabbok River, Jacob would have been surrounded by sand. So the longer he wrestled with the man, the dustier the struggle became. Genesis does not tell us exactly when Jacob realized the man was God. But perhaps it was when the man's touch left Jacob's hip permanently broken. Despite wrestling for many hours and enduring the excruciating pain from his broken hip, Jacob persisted and refused to give up. Now, instead of surrendering, he continued to pursue God for a blessing. You see, Jacob had a relationship with God. And it is because of this relationship that he was able to wrestle with God. Before this wrestling encounter, we read in Genesis chapter 28, verses 10 to 22, that Jacob fled toward Haran and slept at a place later called Bethel, where he dreamt of a stairway between heaven and earth with angels descending and ascending. At the top, God confirmed to Jacob the earlier covenant promises made to his forefathers, Abraham and Isaac. God also promised to be with Jacob, protect him, and bring him back to land safely. Hence, Jacob trusted that God, being ever so faithful to his covenant promises, will bless him. Jacob didn't give up. He stood firm in his relationship with God and held on to his faith until the end. We often describe Christianity as more than just a religion. It is a relationship with God. It is a relationship because God initiates forgiveness, fellowship, and reconciliation with us through Jesus. I wonder, how would you describe your relationship with God today? Is it close, distant, complicated, or something else? And what kind of relationship do you long to have with Him? There's something rather radical and counterintuitive about wrestling with God. However, Jacob shows us that we can wrestle with God because, like him, we too have a relationship with God. As a young boy, I was able to freely wrestle with my father because of our relationship and also because he always let me win. He's turning 80 now, and I've grown at least 3 feet taller, so I don't think a rematch would be advisable. In this passage, wrestling becomes a metaphor or a picture of our struggle with God. Unlike Jacob, our wrestling may not be physical, but rather mental, emotional, or spiritual. You know, as a full-time working professional and a part-time theological student, I'm constantly wrestling with every assignment I need to submit. So Sheila's in front here. I hope she doesn't penalize me for that. I wonder, what are you wrestling with today? Maybe it's grief over the loss of a loved one, a serious illness, a broken relationship, a financial problem, an unhealthy addiction, or perhaps a potentially life-changing decision. In these moments, I want you to know that God is with you and that you can wrestle with Him. You can ask the hard questions, lament honestly, and come before Him as you truly are. You see, our God is not a divine being that you place on an altar and worship from afar. He draws near to us. He meets us where we are in our daily lives through our struggles and our challenges. The British author and theologian C.S. Lewis wrote, God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pain. It is His megaphone to rouse a deaf world. You may wonder if wrestling pushes God away, but in fact, it draws us closer. You see, God will never turn us away because of His steadfast love. The Hebrew word for steadfast love is chesed, and it appears more than 250 times in the Old Testament. In this sense, wrestling with God is very much like a hug with a struggle. Unlike many human relationships, our relationship with God is relational rather than transactional. You see, God made a covenant with Jacob rather than a contract. A covenant is a steadfast promise grounded in God's character of love, grace, and mercy. Often the moment we stop engaging and wrestling with God is the moment we begin to let go of the relationship. The same can be true in marriage or other commitments. When we stop engaging and wrestling, it may mean that we no longer believe that the relationship or the commitment is worth fighting for. God will never give up on us. But the question is, will we give up on Him? In the end, Jacob prevailed and received God's blessing, not by winning the wrestling match, but by surrendering to God. And his dislocated hip is a sign of his dependence on God. And looking at his hip, we are reminded that God could have simply ended the wrestling encounter at any time with a single touch. Yet he allowed Jacob to wrestle with him for many hours from night till daybreak. So I encourage you, never give up. Stand firm in your relationship with God. Hold on to your faith until the end. Can I get an amen? Now, you're now probably wondering, is this guy going to tell me how I can wrestle with God and deepen my relationship with Him? I'm going to leave this last practical part to the last speaker, my dear friend, Sarah Keekens. Over to you, Sarah.
Hi, 11:30. Thank you so much, YuShen, for going before me. Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah, as YuShen mentioned, and it's a real pleasure to take us through the last part of our talk this morning. Friedrich Buchner, in his book, Peculiar Treasures, writes that the worst thing is not the struggle, the worst thing is to let go. And sometimes in my life, when I've gone through a struggle, I've had people say to me, Sarah, just let go. Let it go, let God. And although that advice is not inherently wrong and it doesn't come from a bad place, it's not necessarily what God is always calling us to do. You see, God didn't change Jacob's situation because Jacob simply left it to God. In fact, Jacob did the very opposite. He wrestled God and fought him. In the next 7 minutes, I want to talk to you about what it practically looks like to wrestle God. How can we cling to Him amidst the things that we're struggling with, the intensity of the issues that we face? We're going to pick up from verse 27. The man asked him, "What is your name?" The man asked this question in a way that made a difference because the man was present with Jacob and Jacob was present with the man. So firstly, we see that we need to be present. What does it mean to be present? Clinging to God is so much more about a physicality. It's really about drawing close to God. God knew that Jacob's name was Jacob. And so God asked Jacob this question, not because God doesn't know the answer, but because God is giving Jacob the opportunity to confess to God who he has been. As Kenneth unpacked for us earlier, the name Jacob means heel grabber. So when Jacob says, "My name is Jacob," he's saying, I have been a heel grabber. I tried to take what was not mine. It's God's kindness to Jacob in which Jacob says to him, your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and have overcome. So firstly, we see that we need to be present. Second, clinging to God is to be passionate. Jacob was passionate. He wrestled God. The word cling comes from an old English word, klingan, which sounds like a word in Bahasa to me. I think it's the an at the end. But klingan means to shrink or to wither, to contract and to pull inward. And I want you to remember that, pull inward, to hold tightly. So to cling to someone or to cling to something is to pull them inward. And that's what we see Jacob do. He pulled God inward. When I think of one of my most profound encounters with God, which happened in this very hall, it was on a completely normal Sunday. The only thing that was unique about that Sunday was I was going through something in my life. And I remember I'm a part of the team at HTBB, so I get to be at all three services. And at the 9:30 and the 11:30, I remember just trying to keep God at a distance. I remember thinking, I'm just going to get my work done, I'm going to get through this Sunday, and then I'm going to go home. But it was at the 5 p.m. that I pulled God inward, and I went to the back of the hall where no one was, and I looked up at the same circular air vents that Kenneth looked at, and I remember looking and saying, God, are you even here? Are you even real? And it was like that I felt God pour his love into my heart. You know, the thing is, it's not that God didn't want to give me that experience at the 9:30 or the 11:30. He did. But the thing is, I kept him at a distance. It was at the 5 when I pulled God inward, even though it was heavy for me to be like, God, what are you even doing? It was in that moment that God ministered to me in the deep place of my being. And so I want to tell you this morning that God is not afraid of our tantrums. He can handle them. He's not afraid of our meltdowns. It doesn't matter to God because He wants us to be honest with Him. He wants us to pull Him inward. And so I want to encourage you to pull God inward in your prayer life, but also in the mundane things. Pull God inward. Coming back to the narrative, Jacob is wrestling with this man for a very practical reason. He has a desperate need given the hostility that Esau has for him. So Jacob is not doing this for fun. He's doing this because he truly needs the help of God. It was Levi Lusko, who's one of my favorite authors, who said this: "Significance is not to be achieved, but to be received." Jacob received his new name from God. We're going to pick up from verse 31 now. The sun rose above him as he passed Peniel, and he was limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the Israelites do not eat the tendon attached to the socket of the hip, because the socket of the hip was touched near the tendon. You see, God touched the very place that signified Jacob's strength. You see, the hip is important for mobility, to move around. In the Old Testament, the hip also signified a source of life for the future generations to come. And as Shakira would say, the hips don't lie. Thank you all for laughing. So the hip is so important, and God touches Jacob in the hip because, one, it shows us that God could have ended this match at any time, but also this is the place that signifies Jacob's self-dependence and his strength. A physician by the name of Gavin Francis writes an essay on this whole story, and in this essay he draws out how this touch from God marks Jacob as the father of a nation, but also that this wound is connected to the blessing of becoming Israel. And it's only God that can take a wound and turn it to a blessing. We see that in Jesus as well. God transforms Jacob, he renames him, and he purifies him with his presence. So thirdly, to cling to God, to wrestle him, is to be purified by his presence. God has to break our pride and our self-dependence in order to form a bond that is stronger than the things of this world, that can go through hardship and pain and suffering because this bond is unshakable. And God is doing this with us today because he loves us and wants us to be present with him, passionate about him, and purified like him. So my challenge for you as you go into this week is, how can you be present with God in your prayer life? How can you pray prayers of complete honesty? How can you be passionate about the gospel and about fighting the good fight? And then thirdly, how can you be purified by his presence? It's simply by spending time with him. God loves you and wants you to draw close to him. I'd love to give us the opportunity now to do what we've been talking about, to pull God inward. And so I'd love to invite you to stand. And as we stand, if you'd like, you can put your palms out. And I wonder today, as you do this, if you can just imagine as you put your palm out, that you are pulling God inward, you're reaching for him.